Welcome to In Context. This is the Liberty News and War Report. My name is Ken McDermott Rowe.
I'm Gus Cantivero.
And we're joined this evening by Marchand McDermott Rowe, the show's military affairs commentator. Today we're going to talk about the latest developments in the global wars, and our guest is strategic analyst Rick Rozoff. Rick is the founder of Stop NATO, the international news list, and his articles can be read at globalresearch.ca. Rick, thanks very much for joining us.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
In the past few days, there's been a lot of talk about the possibility of the U.S. attacking Iran. And there's also been talk about possible military intervention in the uprising in Syria. How do policies in Syria and Iran relate to the larger global strategy of the U.S. and NATO?
I think if we see it from the template of eliminating, in many cases, relics, if you will, of the Cold War era, where certain governments were able to negotiate a position intermediate between the two blocs. You know, what was what's known as a non-aligned movement. At one time a very thriving organization, now pretty much a paper organization, but still one with some 122 members. That in the post-Cold War period, that over the past generation, the past 20 years, 21 years, what we're seeing is an unwillingness on behalf of Washington and its major allies in the West to tolerate any sort of independent foreign policy orientation, any willingness for a nation like Syria, for example, to have close state-to-state relations with nations like Russia or Iran. And, Syria's strategic importance is not only that it's located in the Eastern Mediterranean, about which we can say more, but that it has not only close general state-to-state, but also military ties with both Russia and Iran. And as such, in the new model for the 21st century, that's not to be tolerated anymore in Venezuela or Belarus or any other nation that pursues an independent foreign policy. And that one of the purposes for targeting Syria for a regime change, let's be very clear, that's in fact what's being discussed. For a year now, no less authorities than U.S. President Barack Obama, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and their counterparts in nations like France and Germany have called specifically for that. For the head of state of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, to step down and presumably to be supplanted or replaced by a government more to the liking of the West.
In a recent piece, you talked about Russia drawing the line. What did you mean by that, and where's the line being drawn?
It's very interesting. It's somebody I never thought I'd quote, but I'm quoting Arnold de Borchgrave, who you may know as a longtime establishment military and political analyst and a regular contributor to the Washington Times, who had an article picked up by the United Press International, also owned by the Sun and Moon empires, along with the Washington Times, stating that Syria is the 21st century equivalent of Spain and the late 1930s, which is a remarkable observation and not entirely inaccurate. He stated, for example, that whereas from 1937 to 1939, Spain was a battleground almost with proxy forces, that you had the Soviet Union and Mexico, for example, supporting the government, supporting the republic, and you had Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, with the connivance at various times of Britain and arguably even the United States, supporting the insurgent forces of Generalissimo Franco, and that something quite analogous is occurring in Syria currently. We have to, recall that Russia and China twice since last October issued double vetoes in the United Nations Security Council, which, to the best of my knowledge, is the first time that's ever been done in the history of the Security Council. Double vetoes, certainly in recent memory. So that, along the lines of what the Washington Times columnist was talking about, what we're seeing is tiny Syria with some 22, 23 million people, being the chessboard upon which some pretty broad geopolitical battles are being fought out. And that it takes Syria, that is, takes on a lot more significance than simply the next country and the next domino, if you will, in a line that began arguably with Yugoslavia 13 years ago, progressed to Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Libya. But this time, Russia and China seem to be far less compliant or willing to tolerate Western military intervention. We should also, recall that it's been decades, maybe 40, 50 years since China has pronounced itself so forcefully and consistently on any foreign policy issue that didn't directly affect itself. Questions like Taiwan or Tibet and so forth. And it's, maybe reflective in some part of its rising stature as an economic and economic power, that it's willing to take stances like what it has on Syria. But I think more that Russia and China alike, and certainly Iran and other countries that aren't solidly in the Western column, see the developments in Libya last year being replicated, or at least the intent of the Western powers to repeat them in Syria, and see that as a process that will not end at the borders of Syria, and that may very seriously encroach upon their own territories in the imminent future.
Do you see the intervention in Syria and China's opposition to it sorry, to be more clear, is China opposing the intervention in Syria because they see it as a stepping stone to their Iranian oil interests, or because they oppose the Syrian intervention just based on the merits?
On general principles, I think you raise two aspects of it: the very specific and narrow, and the very broad and more principled or even philosophic. And I think both are accurate. The first may have more immediacy, more urgency for China, because it does obtain a good deal of its petroleum from Iran, and that it's conventional wisdom right now that Syria is a stepping stone to Iran, and that if the Assad government were to be overthrown and replaced with one more to the liking of the West, then Iran loses its only dependable ally in the entire Arab world, and arguably in the entire Middle East. As Russia loses its only reliable remaining ally in the Arab world, and its only naval facility on the Mediterranean Sea. I'm talking about the port of Tartus.
I just want to follow up quickly on a statement you just made about the only reliable ally. Isn't it true that Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan would come to the aid of Iran given a direct conflict with the West?
That's an intriguing question. And, to the extent that's true, that because of the Shia majority as reflected in the government in Iraq, and because Pakistan, which borders Iran, of course, would see any attack on or destabilization of Iran is something preparatory, for a similar situation in its own country. And we have to keep in mind that Pakistan borders Iran precisely in its Baluchistan province, which borders, if you will, the sister province of Baluchistan Sistan in Iran, with a Baluch ethnic minority. And we know that in the U.S. Congress a couple of weeks ago, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher held hearings on, calling for self-determination, presumably up to and including independence for Pakistan's province of Baluchistan, which would lead to, the fragmentation or the balkanization of Pakistan. So I think the government in Pakistan, for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the savage attack by NATO aircraft and helicopters last November 26th, that killed at least 24 of their soldiers in Moman Agency in the federally administered tribal areas, but also, a whole host of things, the nature by which Osama bin Laden was killed, the killing of 2 Pakistani civilians by the CIA operative Raymond Davies, and so forth, have antagonized the long-term relationship between Pakistan and the United States, so that Pakistan may be wanting to, if you will, diversify its portfolio geopolitically by not only consolidating its long-standing strategic partnership with China, but in the last year, a very remarkable, noteworthy rapprochement with Russia. Russia is now calling, Russian officials are now calling for full membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for Pakistan, which would lay the basis for a regional, if you will, counterbloc of Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan vis-a-vis the United States and NATO.
Marchand, did you have a question?
I guess I find the concept of breaking up Pakistan and its self-determination for the Baluch tribal people is a very interesting notion, considering we wouldn't even consider the idea of giving New Mexico and Texas back to the Mexicans, or California has a 60% Hispanic population. We're not about to give them independence. So I find the notion very hypocritical in many ways. That we, and it doesn't surprise me, but I think it's very interesting that.
But the balkanization of these target countries seems to be part of a pretty broad strategy. I mean, you see, Libya seems to be breaking up, and it seems like Iraq was perhaps being divided into three parts with the Kurds and taking over control.
I think that may have always been the covert plan to
really
break
to make
Iraq
what
into
is it
three parts.
the Abed-Inyan plan? Abed-Inyan plan from the 80s, the idea of fragmenting the Mideastern states so they could be easily managed, none of them be individually sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, that's the motto, and I think something else that I don't know if you've noticed, but it's again an extremely important point. The ambassador to the United Nations from Sri Lanka announced last week in an interview with Asian Tribune that she saw the recent pressure being brought to bear on the government in Colombo in Sri Lanka about the military campaign against the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE, Lite, which was ended several years ago. But there's increased pressure on by the United States and its NATO allies in Europe against Sri Lanka, and the ambassador of that nation to the United Nations 4 or 5 days ago in the interview I mentioned stated that there has been an unbroken succession by the West, unbroken pattern of categorizing countries as so-called failed states and intervening into their internal affairs, usually military. She cited Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, indicating that she feared her own country could be next. And there was a statement a couple of days ago in Xinhua News Agency from China by, I believe it was an analyst from Sri Lanka, might have been a government official, who stated basically that Sri Lanka is willing to join a bloc of other nations in the world. And this would presumably be, Russia, China, Iran, perhaps Belarus, and certainly the ALBA nations in Latin America, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba, and so forth. To withstand this sort of effort to isolate, discredit, undermine, ultimately overthrow governments.
Marshawn?
I think it's very interesting that you mention. I lost it for a second. That you mentioned the failed state. Even now, taking Syria as an example, presumably the United States could declare Syria a failed state. But even if it does, without being able to get UN Security Council approval, is there any precedence for the United States being able to still intervene, even if Russia and China continue to veto any intervention, which I presume they probably still would?
I'm afraid there are such precedents. There Kosovo, Yugoslavia in 1999, and there Iraq in 2003. Were failing to get particularly Russia and China permanent members and veto-wielding members of the United Nations Security Council on board. The U.S. simply, in the first case, with the war against Yugoslavia in 1999, has used NATO as a substitute, if you will, as a way of usurping the role of the United Nations to wage a 78-day bombing campaign against Yugoslavia. And in the second case, to pull together a coalition of the willing, so-called, which was overwhelmingly comprised of NATO nations, but not officially a NATO mission, that is in Iraq in 2003.
What's interesting about both those different campaigns, and then contrasting to recently with Libya and such, George Bush failed to get international agreement or consensus to do so, but at least he got authority from Congress. Barack Obama didn't get any approval from Congress, but decided that it was good enough to get international agreement, and that was good enough. So neither one of those, to me, is an authorization that's acceptable.
No, you're absolutely correct. Perhaps the three of you may have seen the video that's on YouTube of Leon Panetta, Defense Secretary.
Yeah, that really made me angry.
Yes, who needs Congress, right? Rick, are we perhaps moving from the unipolar world that Vladimir Putin so disapproves of to a bipolar world where the opponents of NATO are going to start to coalesce into a meaningful alliance?
Yeah, I sincerely hope so. It's long overdue. I mean, we would have been spared the last couple of wars, surely, The horrendous massacre that occurred in Kandahar province in Afghanistan this Sunday may not have occurred. The 7-month bombing onslaught and naval blockade of Libya last year would not have occurred, and so forth, had those forces you allude to coalesced, and not so much into a bipolar, but let's use the proper word, into a multipolar war, where there are several centers of power, and that they're both north and south as well as north of the equator, as well as in the east, as well as the west of the world. What we've seen, surely since the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, is we've seen the major Western military and economic powers, and we're really talking about what's known in NATO parlance as the Quint, that is the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, determining where military force can be used in all parts of the world. The so-called North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and we're living in a world that has a perhaps overdeveloped, hypertrophied sense of irony, but misses it when it comes to a military bloc, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in the last 13 years having waged war in Southeastern Europe, South Asia, and North Africa. That is in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, increasingly Pakistan, incidentally, in South Asia, as well as Libya last year. And that, it's incontestable which powers are behind this drive, and that the rest of the world, that is the world, that comprises the 8/9 of humanity that doesn't live in a NATO nation, need to reassert the role of the United Nations, surely, particularly its Article 51 that reserves basically for the United Nations the exclusive right to use military force. It has to be authorized by the United Nations. And to offset and to neutralize what has been a concerted effort by the United States and its NATO allies to portray themselves as the global arbiter of conflicts between and within countries, which is really the new world order, if you will, of the past 20 years.
Yeah, I'm afraid we just have time for one more question.
Yeah, we need to wrap it up soon, but I wanted to get your comments quickly, just to catch up the audience. I'm sure since this is going to be on YouTube, they all know this already, but the Kony 2012 video has gotten many millions of views, and for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a very slickly produced documentary, It tries to purport to be something that's a grassroots effort, but it looks to me like it's got a little bit too much financial muscle behind it to be something that is what it pretends to be, and that's just an activist citizen who is really concerned about human rights in Africa, and that's of course something that people need to be concerned about. But this. The answer to the problem of Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army is to send United States military in to intervene to prevent these atrocities from taking place. But many of the things that's not mentioned in the video, and this video has gotten many millions of views, is that Joseph Kony may not even still be alive. He hasn't been heard from in many months, and they've moved out of Uganda into other countries such as Sudan. Now, the United States previously was not interested in intervening, and there's a part in the film where they actually go to Washington and they get the talk to the hand, that most people usually get when they go to Washington, and showing that they're these heartless individuals. They don't care about child soldiers and such. But then, now that they're in Sudan, all of a sudden there's interest in Washington in intervening, and we have all these Hollywood celebrities getting on the bandwagon. Quickly, what's your thoughts on the LRA, Joseph Kony, United States intervention into Sudan? Is this just another geopolitical ploy to try to grab the resources in Sudan?
Yes, it is. Simply, but you characterize, your background is perfect. It truly is. It places things in absolute correct perspective. And this comes on the heels, of course, of the Obama administration deploying an initial contingent of over 100 special forces troops to Uganda, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, the general area, ostensibly to exclusively, fight against the Lord's Resistance Army. This would be the first, openly acknowledged military campaign in Africa since the war against Libya last year by the United States, and its latest, the first post-Cold War overseas military command, U.S. Africa Command. Though I suspect, and I've recently had occasion to write about the fact that the United States is engaged in a counterinsurgency war in Mali, in Northwest Africa, and of course it has. large military base in Djibouti in Northeast Africa, the Combined Task Force Horn of Africa. And the fact that this video surfaces precisely at the time where Washington is starting a counterinsurgency operation comparable to what it's been doing in the Philippines, incidentally, as well as Colombia and other nations. And, 21st century, at least, post-George W. Bush administration, American warfare consists of unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, and special operations forces. Those are the two major emphases. And this would be a test case, I suppose. And this Kony video is a perfect public relations, effort to legitimize that effort.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for helping us make sense of these global wars. We look forward to speaking with you again about it. Could you please let us know your website for the viewers?
Yeah, thank you for asking. If you go to any search engine, Google, for example, and simply type in Stop NATO, or my name, Rick, last name Rozoff. I have the first couple entries ought to be for the website and for the email mailing list. I'd invite people to join that, incidentally. There's a daily digest where you would receive only one email a day that would contain information on most of the areas you were speaking about.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Rick. We look forward to speaking to you again soon. You've been watching In Context with Ken, Gus, and Marchand. We look forward to seeing you all soon, too.
Talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.